So I don't know if folks in this room should know why that's funny, right? Because it doesn't all add up. It all can't be done. So what ended up happening was the caucuses are not government-run elections. These are privately run elections like golf clubs or the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or the Oscars. So they had to put together start to finish end-to-end voting systems that were going to be customized and rented. And I just want to point out that there is no legal penalty for interfering with a non-government election. So I don't know why other reporters didn't want to cover this, but there really weren't, almost like nobody covering this. Because I thought this was the biggest easy threat to disrupt 2020, which is, you mess with the #1 Iowa and the #3 nominating contest for the Dems. I mean, what could go wrong, right? So what I started to do was follow their process. So they put together these RFPs, these requests for proposals, in Iowa and Nevada, where they wanted vendors to tell them how to get this stuff done. So let's see let me just tell you what they wanted to try to do. Iowa decided they wanted people to vote by telephone and use a keypad on the telephone to punch in the votes. And this is not any regular ballot. These are ranking candidates. So you would have to get on the phone and listen to a recording and press 2 for Biden and for wait to 23 to press 23 for Warren and do it 5 times. And hope that that you didn't make a mistake. Before you could do that, you would have to go online and register and get an email, delivered password and PIN, and then they were going to take care of the counting at the end of the process and create 4 statewide precincts. In Nevada, because they wanted to be more democratic about it, they wanted to do that exact same thing, but have each precinct chair, now there are 1,700 local precincts, have an app that would tell them the early vote totals that had been done beforehand. They could announce them to the room. So you're in a room with 25 people, and all of a sudden you tell them that 60 people in their precinct voted for Bernie before, but they're not there. And then report in real time the results in the room and have the app then recalculate everything until there are no longer viable candidates. And they thought that 1,700 people were going to be using this app correctly, and the app would work and it would function. And that there somehow would be a paper record produced by this. So anyway, so what I started doing was, I started writing stories by looking for, I was thinking, what reporting would be influential here? Because this was kind of being pushed by Tom Perez, coming pretty much from the top down. And I decided I did not have to do it. I would not speculate. I wouldn't be theoretically about fears. I wouldn't write about conspiracies. I would look for precedents that could be cited as red flags. And astoundingly, there were a lot of precedents, and some of them are really funny. So in 2016, it turns out that the Utah Republican Party had party-run caucuses. Now, some people associated with this, some of the folks in this room put up spook pages, which are like fake pages for people to log in and to prove that what you see is not real. But they didn't even have to do that. Because what happened was, the Utah Republican Party was told by the RNC to use Eventbrite for voter registration. Eventbrite, where you have parties, and you invite people in. And that was their voter registration portal. So they had 40,000 people sign up. Guess what happened on the day that was supposed to happen? Well, it did not exactly sync with the underlying state voter registration database, and then they were not able to get in and log in, and then the Secretary of State's office started getting data used by calls because there weren't enough helplines. So it kind of fell apart before it began. But the vendor who was supposed to do all the calculating, who built the LA system, Smartmatic, called it a great success when 27,000 people voted on their systems. They didn't mention that 13,000 didn't get it. In 2018, Utah tried to do it again with another online platform called Votes, V-O-A-T-Z. It's a smartphone app. They didn't anticipate that people wouldn't get the app until the last minute. And then, so they had the App Store, you couldn't get through the door of the App Store. And then if you got on, we couldn't do the authentication process in time. And again, so it blew up. You know, they had to revert to paper. These kinds of errors, by the way, are not unique to this. In Quebec, last fall, municipal elections are run online there. And 50 municipalities had to postpone voting by a day. Because somebody working for the vendor didn't type 10 into the order to the telecom company to increase the bandwidth by that magnitude. So all of a sudden the pipes were 1/10 as wide as they should have been, and the data couldn't flow. Yeah, so the thing about it is, what ended up happening here, I'm going to try to compress this a little bit, is that these kinds of things, examples came out. I also found examples about how people were actually able to literally do the electronic equivalent of stealing, like paper ballots, the ballot box stuffing in North Carolina 9. And this was done in the province of Quebec. In 2017, the Conservative Party there, doing, again, state party-run elections, they targeted the new Canadian citizens. They went to the communities where the Sikhs had their temples. And they said, we want you to vote, be part of our party. And we're going to help you fill out the registration forms. So they filled out everything, and then they said, we'll turn them in for you. And when they turned them in, the party operatives filled in their emails. So they got the passwords and the logins. And my source for that was the deputy premier who lost that race, and some of the religious leaders from those communities. So the Democrats, again, they wanted people to log in, get IDs, passwords, pins. Some of the early PIN numbers, by the way, were like 30 digits. People cannot manage 30 digits. So the thing is, they wanted, so at a certain point, I'm going to try to really compress this. They were hearing that a lot of things could go wrong, and the state party chairs in Iowa and Nevada were saying, we want to sign contracts. We approve us. We want to sign the contracts and get this going. And the Rules and Bylaw Committee, basically, they asked their tech staff what was going on, because like I was writing these articles, and like they were looking at me like, here's the troublemaker. So their new tech director, Bob Lord, created a technical advisory committee with people who were some associated with verified voting, some from like the academic community. They basically told them this was completely nuts. And then it couldn't be done securely. And it couldn't, they said, look at the risk assessment. It cannot be secure, it cannot be reliable. By the end of August, they pulled the plug. So, and they said they're not going to do it. But the thing is, I was waiting to see the systems that were actually going to be done, presented in public. They never presented them. They were not able to complete the end-to-end system and actually have it be evaluated, let alone tested or trained or any of that stuff. And so fortunately, sometimes political people will listen to the facts. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes this Tom Perez, the DNC chair, was putting out press releases as of July saying we're doing virtual voting in Nevada. It's going to be great. He had to pull back, and the only people who really noticed this were the state party people who feel like they spent months and months working very hard on something that wasn't getting up to task. But the story's not really over, because basically Alaska still has to decide what they are. The DNC has to decide if Alaska is going to use votes via smartphone for its caucuses. I'm sort of hearing through the grapevine that they're going to be denied. But all of these systems that they were thinking about using, all the elements of these are what we hear about as parts of the new possible voting systems. Online content, creating a paper trail that follows some kind of online thing. And so this was sort of like a small microcosm that showed that this stuff is really not ready for prime time. And I'll just I'll just leave it there. I mean, I think that I think that it's unfortunate. I'll just change the subject a little bit. It's unfortunate that some of the folks who verified voting aren't here today. because they're working to promote ballot marking devices in a bunch of states. And it would be really great if people could have an adversary-free discussion about what's the smart use to use smart technology at key points in the system. You know, what's happening out there is, you know, a lot of folks like, you know, Garland, you've been fighting these ballot marking devices. People are talking to the state officials behind your back to try to figure out ways to audit them. And the thing about it is they are getting audited, but are the audits, and is the data, are it going to be good enough? And we can, and you know, by my count, this number's really conservative. There's going to be 130,000 of these new ballot marking devices coming online, you know, in the biggest jurisdictions by 2020. You know, ES&S's sales material says 70,000. LA is 40,000. You know, Georgia, which goes to Dominion, is 30,000. You know, these numbers are only going to go up. And we got to figure out what's the best way to deal with this stuff. And we're not having those discussions, and that's really unfortunate. Instead, some of the people who are associated, and people are really deflecting to verify voting. You know, I'm just saying this because it needs to get out there. The FBI put out a statement last week about somebody trying to break into this West Virginia smartphone pilot last November and got getting caught. This is one Alex Haldeman's students. These are the same people who put out papers at DEF CON saying you can't do anything with images, and they don't really, and this is really counterproductive, it's kind of baby. We've got to do better with this. You know, there's a point where, like, you know, all these new systems have these digital records built in, and you're telling me that we can't use half of what's there in some constructive manner. You know, under situations where you prepare it with like the strengths of paper and the strengths of digital analytics, but you're backed up by human judgments and key decision points. I just think it's nuts that we're sort of this is a really small community and it's not putting these brains and heads together in the best way. So maybe that'll change because I try to be optimistic and like I said, with this the DNC, I mean, believe it or not, they stopped themselves from a major self-inflicted wound. So maybe some people will be amenable to reason. So I just, thanks very much for letting me tell that story. It was it was a small piece of my reporting career, but it was very gratifying to see that you cover something and actually have people respond to facts, reason, track records, precedents, risk assessments based on reliability and security. It can be done, but that's nice.
Can you speak more directly to
Yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Steve, I want to thank you for the work you've done since 2004. Most people know what he does is really just write about elections. And he was in North Carolina with us. Okay, he came in to see what was going on where no other reporters really were working this. Look at the difference that he made of stopping something really stupid. Okay? Because we know that are where they stack the chairs on the Titanic. Okay? And get the ship ready to go. It's very typical that in those first two primaries, they know breaking out of the box is very important because people want to jump on that Wesso bandwagon. If you know what Wesso is, they're looking for the bone. Okay? It's a Mexican term. Okay? How politics works down there. And it proves that people like Steve and others believe what JFK said. He said, one person can make a difference and everybody should try. Wow, what a concept, huh? Thank you. And my question to you, of course, is ballot images. Could you do a little talking about Maryland?
Okay.
Model? Thank you.
Okay, so here's the thing. When people talk about audits and people talk about recounts, they are not the same. And people are confused about that. So after election night, there's a process that ends with the certification of the winner. In every state, the length is different. It could be 2 weeks, it could be 1 week, it could be 3 weeks. And usually you have this process where these local election boards meet. It's called the canvassing board, and they go over what's disputed. They try to reconcile it, and then candidates come in and they can challenge it, or if the margins are so thin, it will go count. So what Maryland decided to do, and it's the only state that has done this, is take a look at ballot images to try to double check the votes as best they could before certifying the winners. And they've done this for a couple cycles now, and they've basically found races that have been separated by less than 10 votes, and you can't get this granular with the risk limiting audit, and shown people the data. And people being the candidates, and people have accepted. These are all very lawyered up contests, and without having to go to every count. So what do they actually do? They forced DSNS to give them the data of all the images from the central tabulators, and then and this includes, by the way, some ballot marking device machines. And then they basically tried to just do a separate count, and a secondary count. This was the contract for the clear ballot, to see if it was what matched and what differed, and figure out what was incongruous. And what they found with the ballot summary cards, the barcodes, and this is kind of important for folks who are working in states where ES&S is selling these, is that 3% of the barcodes printed on by the DS200 scanners were unreadable. So what they did was they ended up having to look at the name down below that was printed, and that's how they continued their audit process. So that company that's doing this clear ballot, clear audit, said they're going to try to make this a commercial feature of their next, as they go forward. If you step back from this, this is completely like new territory. What's the best way to deal with this data, to deal with these data sets, to do double check? And I know that there are, people have can say all kinds of problems. We know that they ran out of paper ballots in Maryland, that people were disenfranchised, and some of these ballot summary cards came from using the machines for the disabled voters. But which is, this is not a good way to generate a test. But anyway, that's what they're doing, and it's interesting. The best ballot image audits are not from Maryland, by the way. They were developed by Ian Sancho, and folks in this room know who he is. He used to be the supervisor of elections in Leon County, Tallahassee, Florida. And it's so simple, it defies. The concept is you have a paper record. You're running through two sets of independently unconnected scanners. You compare the results. You figure out what doesn't match up and why. And as it comes out of that second scanner, it goes onto a shelf like a library. So you can pull the paper and fight about that if you want to go before a board. So Maryland is important. Florida is important. But a lot of people are not looking to use these images as important, which is unfortunate.
The question is, for the digital voting, either online or through the apps, what percent of them not using it was because it wasn't complete, and what percent of it was because of security? Did they address the security concerns at all?
No numbers, really. I was told that 40,000 people signed up online for the Utah 2016 their caucuses. 27,000. The vendor said 27,000 used the system. The state election director, who's a Republican, told me at least 10,000 couldn't get in. They were using. There was a series of failures there. That wasn't just one failure. First you had this registration using Eventbrite, which was like completely like a data format that's not synced with state voter registration databases. Then you have people who couldn't get the app, to go to the next stage and get it and authenticate it on time. And then you have, this is really important too, because this is true with all these new systems that are coming online. Where's the help desk for people who are using these for the first time in the 2020 primaries? The vendor said, don't worry. Well, believe me, people were really confused, and there was nobody to call. So I can't be any more specific than that. The other mistakes are like the vendor votes. This is how crazy this stuff gets. They did not adjust their back end to allow a higher volume of people to download an app. So the Republicans in Utah in 2018 thought it was a denial of service, a DDoS, a distributed denial of service attack by the Russians. This is what they were telling me. Because the vendor didn't pre-configure the system, They thought the Russians were sabotaging the Republican caucuses.
I guess if they get it to work, do they even care about the security?
These, I don't know. I mean, the thing about this is they have used these tablets and voting things in like convention centers. And then they've had all these young kids running around and telling people how to fill this out and do this and do that. But you can't really have that in a presidential caucus. It's like I can imagine my parents picking up the phone and saying, Steven, finish this for me. I can't do it. Or you can have lots of campaign volunteers banging on doors. Let me do this for you. And on and on.
My question is about state parties, where there's a lot of action, and how the message is getting to them. Last spring, 2017, was the state nominating convention for Michigan Democrats, and they had the classic bottleneck where they had everybody coming to vote at a few tablets, and you had to have been registered to be a Democrat a month in advance. So there was chaos going on at that level, and absolutely no sign of much security or even privacy in the voting. And they eventually did nominate some good candidates after one heck of a fight for the AG. They actually nominated a Secretary of State who went on to campaign on my organization's security platform for elections, which was a good thing. But here we have a state party just totally violating every rule in the book. There's a disconnect there.
There's a complete disconnect. And the thing I observed the most was that the state party executive director in Iowa, who I consider a friend until he stopped returning my phone calls. And then the person who was the newly hired caucus director in Nevada, who they yelled at me because they thought I was being hyperbolic. But anyway, the thing is, they trust their vendors more than they trust anybody else. And that is the biggest point we're trying to, and that's where this disconnect and this impenetrable wall really comes out. Because they were saying, let us do this, we're so emotionally invested, and the vendors kept saying, we can build this, we can build this. And when I talked to some of these vendors, I found out who was doing the telephone interface, and I said, so who are we sending the data to? How are you going to interact with who's doing the tabulations? And they said, we don't even know who's doing that. This was in August. So this is like, now these are non-governmental, which makes them really vulnerable to this even like more kind of amateurish stuff.
Keep covering it.
Last question.
Hi, great talk. I had a question about the combination of a couple of things covered in yesterday's talks about the emergence of new technologies such as blockchain and coupling with what you're talking today about, and that there's not a whole bunch of knowledge for the average citizen about that. But then also something else mentioned yesterday about knowing like the beneficial owners of vendors and related. So the app you're talking about, Go apps or Votes, they're going through their Series A funding right now, and it's co-led by Medici Group, which is a fully owned subsidiary of Overstock, whose CEO just stepped down because of his relationship with the Russian foreign agent. And I wonder if you like.
I know a lot about the vote system, actually. It's really, 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 really interesting. This is using a smartphone as a ballot marking device. And the rationale for this system, is that why do we have to build something overpriced like Express Votes that are running on Windows 7 when we can lean on Google and Apple's cybersecurity platforms and all their biometrics and the hundreds of millions of dollars that they have spent. So what Votes does, and I'll get to exactly what this is, the vendors on this. So what Votes does is, to register, you have to take a video selfie and match that with a photograph so that the phone is tied to a single voter. And they also take pictures of the of like a driver's license and other stuff, because what they're doing is they're actually going into what is the whole identity proofing industry that was created, the Patriot Act, after 9/11. And so they're creating, so they're saying that they're privately holding, and they would never share all this incredibly personal profiling data that is getting independently verified. Now, the reason the FBI caught one of Halderman's students and traced it back to him when he tried to hack their trial in November, was because he didn't know that on top of a smartphone, there's like 20 different metrics of how you interact with the screen that can be tied to other like lower tier identifiers that can take you back. And that's how that happens. So Votes' vendors has a couple of vendors who do that biometric stuff. Now, to me, this is much more interesting than the blockchain stuff, because basically, they know, I think they know, I mean, they lose this in talks, that they can't really have secret ballots. You can't have a secret smartphone ballot, because there's too much embedded identifiers going on. And people like David Jefferson will say, well, where does all that information go? Who gets it? Who keeps it? Which is what you're saying there. Votes has sort of like a secret funder that's covering all of their pilots, which is Bradley Tusk, who might be the luckiest political consultant in the world, because he basically went to work for the guy who founded Uber for stock. And he walked away with like $100 million. And he's working on smartphones and fighting poverty. So he keeps putting all this money into like keeping this company going. And their whole business plan is to keep going until 5G really takes off. Because then they think that they'll be able to use everything everywhere. So, what they want to do is they've tried to go after voters where you don't have to have a secret ballot. So that's why they've gone overseas to try to do some of the overseas stuff. And that's why they also are trying to target some of the disability community. And that hasn't really become public yet. Because they think that they can get court cases where people will say, we don't want to deal with paper. We want to do something that's more friendly with us. And then they can basically get a decision where the remedy will be something for votes. And that will be a business success, because that's replicable. Like people used to go and sue states for not doing automatic voter registration. And that's where they're at. And they were supposed to be used in Alaska. The Alaska Party, Democratic Party, wants to use them, for their 2020 April caucus. And the Rules Committee was saying, well, it's only 4 caucus, so whatever. But other people are saying, no, you can't do this. You can't have the DNC rubber stamp that and give it like a seal of approval. That decision is not forthcoming, but it's probably going to be in the next week or so against it. So probably more than what you envisioned, but that's the front line of all